So, as you can see, our objective with the film is really to showcase that there are already holistic solutions out there that we can benefit from in our natural environments. I mean, it must come as no surprise to you if you've seen the viral video that was just released by Greta saying there's an incredible machine, a machine that can actually decarbonize our air. It's called a tree, right? And the whole point is we're looking at natural solutions here and how they can actually come into energy efficient policies, but also be driven by societies and how they can save money by using these kinds of tools and solutions. We obviously know in the film that there are advantages and disadvantages to all types of renewable energy solutions, and we are aware of the ones that we are faced with biogas, including pathogens and antibiotics and hormones that can retain. We are not saying that this is the utopian vision. We are saying that by giving these kinds of films and human stories to the public, they can consider alternative solutions that they may never have thought about before and break taboos. Heinz Peter is completely revolutionizing a refugee camp that is not even habitable at the moment. And in the world, we should not tolerate as a human rights situation for people to be living in. Through environmental solutions, he's trying to fix that. So the question is, if we refine and improve the research, can shit really bring us together?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that our shit here is not yet used, but maybe that is a plan and a goal for those exhibition and conference areas which want to be certified in the future, that this is included. Thank you, Danielle. I have some questions myself, but I would prefer that there are some questions from the floor. What do you think? Has anybody of you ever used such a toilet? Okay. So it is a familiar thinking. Have you all fully understood how the technology works? Not all? Danielle, I would ask you, I think the film did not really show that. Just tell us in very short words, in a way, what happens with the shit and how does suddenly methane and turbines moving and whatever comes up?
Okay, well, I'm certainly not a scientist, so I'm not going to try and explain this in a kind of advanced way. But from what we've understood from Heinz Peter, there is like a distillation process that happens, that can actually happen within the sewage system, a kind of sewage digestive process. And actually, you can completely distill the sewage to even take out clean water. So you kind of separate the toxins. And I think there was a whole stunt with Bill Gates as well, where he drank a clean glass of water that was originally a pile of shit. So that's a very basic definition, I would say, but that's how I generally understood it from a producer's perspective. I don't know if you have more insight to offer on that, or if anybody else does.
But I understand that there is the methane as an energy source, and then there is the rest as a fertilizer.
Exactly.
Both can be used independently.
Exactly.
You mentioned yourself issues with medication, hormones, and so on. I think we are all aware that even our own shit is not that clean anymore as it should be. And maybe getting less and less clean, even with microplastics in our bodies and so on. What do you think? How do these people deal with that? Does it not impact on our lifestyles as such, if that technology would be widely used?
In the sense, will it have a negative impact if they use that?
No, I mean, should we then, if that technology would be used widely, should we then not also change some of our lifestyles in regards to what we take into our body, what apparently will get out as well?
Well, I think what we definitely show in the film is it's a supply chain, our digestive system, it goes in and it comes out, and there are processes and steps in between. The same process would apply. You'd have to think about the types of things you're eating, the kind of digestion process you're going to have, what you're outputting. Actually, your shit becomes gold. It becomes a value-added process, and it makes you save money. So, yes, there is a whole supply chain. It is not that you just, we carry on living our lives the way we do. In order to really benefit from what comes out of us, we have to really profit and take care of what we put into our bodies. They say you are what you eat, and I think that's a very good point that you make.
In a market economy, our shit would become more valuable the cleaner it is, ideally. Exactly. And we would need regulation and standards and whatever. Please.
I'm Jason Artis.
Please take the micro, that's easier.
Hi there. I'm Jason Moroney-Cady from Urban Farming Company. And I love this concept of the whole circularity of this principle. But I think my question is, maybe it's linked to one of your comments about how this is a machine and it's capable of taking away carbon dioxide, and the content of the video. And it just seems that as humans we kind of separate technology and nature. And often we always look at technology as a savior for our society. And so the question is, do you think that we as individuals have an issue with maybe revisiting nature and the way that nature breaks down excrement and leaves and plants and organic materials, return that back into the natural cycle is the way things have always been and the way that things will always be in the future. But it just seems that we need technology, we need a machine, something that we've designed to give us our solution. So I don't know.
We don't want to get our hands dirty anymore.
Well, it seems that way, and the question is, why is it that we seem to think that technology is the way forward, but looking to nature and natural processes seems to be quite short-sighted in our perspectives?
I couldn't agree more, and I think I'm probably going to pick up on something that Dr. Jan Rosenow said, which is there is a breakdown in synergies between all kinds of policies, and that means technology and innovation doesn't look at what currently is in place, but rather finding new solutions constantly. And that means that often energy efficient solutions are also using energy to build the technologies. They're not looking at ways that could be effective in the current resources we have. So I would totally agree with you in that. And you bring up a good point about the film. We are only 75% way through our development. It's coming out 2020. We're looking at we have 3 broadcasters on board, Canada, Norway, Germany, and we're currently talking with BBC Scotland. And so we are looking for perspectives, those that do not believe biogas is an effective solution to feature in the film, and also companies that work with biogas solutions who would be willing to be featured in the film. So we are still expanding the kind of impetus that we could bring in the film to an audience. So if there is anybody here today that would like to pick up my card and give me some details on that, I just thought I'd mention that before we close today.
Thank you, Danielle. One more question now, otherwise we will see Danielle again in the short panel afterwards. So that was completely different to the presentation before, right? And now we are doing another change and expose ourselves to another dimension of that debate. And we welcome Carolyn Snell from the University of York in the UK. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Social Policy and Social Work. So you are looking into the situation of parts of societies which, let us call them the poorer people apparently. So you speak about balancing fuel poverty and climate policy. You explain us what is fuel poverty and who is affected at the moment.
Yeah, in 10 minutes. I don't have.
You have time. It's fine.
So from shit to fuel poverty, I'll do my best. Okay, so just to introduce myself a little bit more, my name's Carolyn Snell from the University of York. I'm based in the Department of Social Policy and Social Work. But I've always had an interest in trying to bring environmental issues together with social policy issues, especially poverty and destitution. So the last 15 years worth of my work have looked at that relationship between the environment and poverty. And what my work, because I'm in a policy-focused policy-focused department, my work has been about looking to make fairer policies of sustainable development that reflect on the needs of the poor who live in the present, with also thinking about people in the future. So that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. Over the last 10 years, my work's really been on fuel poverty, which I think is often referred to as energy poverty as well, but I'm going to use the term fuel poverty. It's the one I'm familiar with. And I've been looking at the relationship between fuel poverty, climate change, and policy. On the face of it, there's a potential conflict between these two things. To reduce fuel poverty, we could simply give the fuel poor more money, or we could subsidise their energy bills in order to let them have enough energy to have a comfortable life. Obviously, this has a potentially knock-on effect in terms of increasing carbon emissions, because you're essentially giving someone license to use more energy. Equally, activities to reduce carbon can have a knock-on effect on fuel poverty. So if, for example, we put a tax on fuel, it's going to generally affect the poorest people the most. It's going to have the most negative impact on the poorest groups. So my work has been about trying to look at ways of kind of balancing those two things. So, just very briefly to explain how I understand fuel poverty and how the UK government understands fuel poverty. In the UK, it's been attributed to a combination of low incomes. We might be a wealthy country, but we're a very unequal country with high levels of poverty and destitution. Very poor energy efficiency. We have a terrible housing stock in the UK. I think it might be the worst across Europe. We have very leaky housing that needs quite a lot of work to kind of make it more efficient. And we also have relatively high energy bills. We have an entirely privatised energy market. Energy bills are often a political issue during times of election, possibly not so much in the last couple of years, but over the last 10 years certainly energy bills have really been a kind of major political issue. It's very easy to get caught up in the technical discussions about fuel poverty. I'm not going to go down the road of trying to define it or measure it today, or even talk about whether or not it's a useful concept at all. What I would like to say is, in my experience, this is something that is happening. It's something that people feel on a daily basis. I've popped a couple of quotations up from a couple of the research projects that we've done over the last 10 years, just to give you a flavour of what it's like to be fuel poor. It's something that affects people on a daily basis. It is something that's pervasive. It's something that causes extreme worry, anxiety, depression. It makes people feel cold all the time. If you have a disability, perhaps you need to live in a slightly warmer environment. If you don't heat yourself to that environment, you're likely to become more ill, more unwell. If you have young children in the home, you need to keep those children nice and warm, and you'll be worrying constantly about finding ways to keep your children warm. If you're on your own in your home, often you might end up going to bed and spending the day in bed in order to stay warm because you have no other solutions. You might also, like Christine, the first person who's in the quotation there, you might find yourself having to make very difficult decisions around heating your home and buying food, really basic kind of food commodities. I think it's also really important to stress that it's a life-threatening issue. In the UK, we lose people every winter as a result of fuel poverty. It's linked to excess winter deaths. So it's a serious public health concern. From my experience of doing this research over the last 10 years, I would say that it's something that has worsened, not improved. If we look at the official measures, it probably hasn't changed that much, but I think the austerity measures that have been implemented in the UK, the shift to a more conservative government, the retrenchment of public policies, have led to less investment in housing and less support for the fuel poor and a reduction in social security benefits. So people who are in fuel poverty are probably feeling it much more harshly than they were perhaps 15 years ago. And that's where we have people like Christine who are saying they're having to make those difficult choices between food and fuel. That's the sad bit, but the really positive thing is this is an entirely fixable situation. We're in a developed country, there are policy ways of addressing this that are entirely plausible. And in the UK, the main way of approaching fuel poverty has been through energy efficiency, so retrofit of our housing stock. So generally improving windows, so inserting triple glazing, for example, improving walls, floors, putting in new heating systems. And the UK policy has been explicit about trying to bring together carbon concerns and fuel poverty concerns. So we're trying to improve the housing stock, we're trying to reduce our carbon emissions, whilst we're also trying to do that in the poorest homes, so in the homes that contain the fuel poor. So it's been about, the policy agenda has been about combining these two policy goals. It's been an explicit policy. Again, over the last decade, policies changed quite a bit. So when I first started doing this research, there were publicly funded schemes that undertook retrofit of housing, and some privately funded schemes. What we have now is solely funded through the private sector and through energy bills. So, for example, if I paid my gas bill through British Gas, a part of that bill would be paying for this system of retrofit. The This has been criticised across the board as being regressive, as it places a greater burden on the fuel poor as compared to the taxation system. I'll put that to one side for a minute and just think through some of the other issues that I would say we've experienced in the UK that perhaps other people, other policymakers might learn from and do in a different way. And I think a lot of this is because we're developing things through the private sector. I think that's caused quite a few problems. The first issue then is that I feel that policy has emphasised the importance of doing retrofit work that is low cost with high carbon savings. So it's all about doing things at the lowest possible cost. And as a result, it's focused on the number of properties that are being treated rather than thinking about the depth, the quality or the suitability of the retrofit that's been implemented, very much as was said first thing this morning. And as a result, a lot of properties haven't been treated simply because they're too expensive to deliver to and because the carbon savings aren't regarded as high enough. The problem is that most of the fuel poor tend to live in the worst quality housing. So in the end, they're kind of being overlooked because because there's not the carbon savings and they're too expensive to deliver to. So they're not actually being eligible for the support because they're too expensive on paper. There's a further restriction as well to accessing support. Excuse me. The eligibility criteria to actually getting this support is incredibly restrictive. You have to be in the right housing sector, you have to be on the right social security benefits. And I think in 2017, only 50% of the fuel poor were actually eligible for any kind of support at all. And then their housing would also have to be suitable and cheap enough to treat. Even when the building is eligible and the household is eligible, there are still further barriers to actually taking up this kind of support. Firstly, because we're offering it through the private sector and through a variety of different energy companies, it's created this incredibly complex landscape where offers of work are made over a period of 6 months perhaps by one company and then another offer is made somewhere else. And as a customer, as a consumer, it's incredibly difficult to make any kind of sense of what's available and why it's been offered. And the households we spoke to simply didn't understand why they were being offered insulation by British Gas or why they were being offered a new boiler by Empower. It just didn't make sense to them. They couldn't make sense of this really complex environment. And they also didn't trust what they were being offered. They were very suspicious about why it was being offered and whether it might come with some kind of additional cost and some degree of unpredictability. And also they were quite concerned about the degree of mess that it might involve in implementing it. And these fears and this confusion tended to prevent a lot of households from actually going ahead with the measure at all. So they were eligible, they had the right kind of housing, but they still didn't receive it because they just didn't have the trust in what was being offered to them. And overall, I think what came out of this was that despite this being England's only fuel poverty policy, the actual needs of the fuel poor were essentially being ignored. It's been aimed at them, but their needs are not being considered within this. Measures that they were being offered weren't particularly appropriate, they were just the cheapest ones. The whole house approaches that we know are kind of best for really poor housing weren't being offered because they were too expensive. On occasions, a household might be offered a measure, say a new boiler, but then they weren't offered the additional things like the new pipework and flushing out the pipework that you would need to make that actually work properly. Households were ineligible for support, and they also didn't understand the information that was being communicated to them, and it was communicated in a very rapid, very kind of lack of a way that didn't kind of understand their particular needs. In places, local authorities and charities and NGOs worked with the energy sector to try and provide better solutions. So they put in additional funds to allow this extra work, so the pipe work, to be made, or to allow households that weren't eligible because they didn't have the right social security benefits to allow them to receive support. This worked really well in the areas where it was offered, but obviously it was very patchy, and in the end a national policy became very patchy, and you might be able to access support in York, but perhaps not in London. Excuse me. So, and I've just put the words here of an energy company just to kind of stress my point. Just sort of bringing this all together, I do believe we can develop and deliver retrofit that lowers our carbon footprint. I think that's absolutely possible, particularly in the UK with such the poor housing stock that we've got. And energy companies believe this too, and they believe that they can deliver it as well. But I think if we want to address issues of fuel poverty at the same time, we need to accept that some households are going to be more expensive to deliver to, and the carbon savings are going to be a lot lower. And that's not a reason to be turning them away, especially not if we're trying to meet these two objectives at the same time. So personally, I would say in the UK and actually throughout the world, there's a clear role for the state to step back in and fund the improvements to those most in need. I see this as a social policy issue that shouldn't be delivered through energy companies. So I just wanted to come back to those couple of quotations again, just to stress again that need of putting fuel-poor households back into the heart of what we're doing if we're going to say that this is both a climate policy and a fuel poverty policy. And that's me done.
Thank you. Caroline, we still have time, and I would encourage some direct questions to her now, and later in the panel we can go to more general questions. Please.
Hi. Can you hear me?
My name is Camille Pollan. I'm with the City of New Orleans. And my question to you is, if there are individuals in your study or in some of the examples that you were looking at that kind of fall into the gap, like maybe they have some money that they could fund some energy efficiency projects, they're not on public assistance, but they don't really have the access to the information or to the reputable contractors. So are there programs, national programs or utility programs that address that population as well?
There's certainly advisory services in the UK, and they've done a really good job. So Citizens Advice and the Energy Saving Trust have given huge amounts of information. In Scotland, the Energy Saving Trust will actually link you up into schemes. The Scottish Government put money into schemes as well. So, sorry. So yes, there are these advisory services. In terms of actually putting additional funds in, less so. It would depend on your circumstances, and it would also really depend on where you lived and if there was a particular scheme going on where you lived. I've got to say, the study we did was across the UK, and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all put in more money and supported those people that you were talking about kind of on the edge, whereas England has just pulled everything back completely. I should also say I brought our policy guide and practitioner guides along with me, and they're on a table over there, so do take them away with you. That will explain a lot more about the policy context, but also the policy recommendations that we've made.
Thank you.
Modelled over there by the gentleman.
I'm not so sure if you all can see, but the stand is over there and you can find it. There was one question over there.
You have talked mostly, if I understood well, about... my name is Dirk van Orshoven. I'm an independent engineer here in Belgium. You have talked mostly about people who own their own house, their own dwelling. Or is it applicable to rental houses as well?
Yeah, I've got to say one of the good things that policy has done in the UK is to recognise the need to go into the private rented sector, because that's one of the hardest areas to treat. So there has been an active move into the private rented sector. I think landlords have to give consent, but they don't. I think they have to, if they decline a measure, there has to be a really good reason for it. So there's a lot more pressure on landlords now to accept measures. And yeah, so a lot of this has been actually geared towards the private rented sector. It doesn't apply to the social rented sector, and the idea behind that is that the local authorities that look after that housing should be doing the work themselves. Unfortunately, in the UK, there's been a decline in investment in social housing, so actually now there's a crying need to go back into those areas and invest in them. But yes, it's probably, to be honest, it would be quite hard to get a lot of these measures as an owner-occupier because your incomes would probably look too high because you'd have a mortgage.
Let me just add a question from my side. It looks as if housing is a key area of energy consumption, right?
Yeah.
That's what you said. So there is a debate, and then there are problems, I think, far beyond the poorest part of the society. The debate, for example, in Germany is that each type of insulation, of retrofitting, of investments into flats which you rent will increase the rent prices at the end, which are anyway going up enormously. So how is that debate in the UK? I mean, somehow it's logic. If you invest and if something improves, the rent would be higher at the end. So that affects middle class meanwhile as well.
Yeah. I don't know how to answer that. Yes, that is a problem, that is an issue. It has been thought about. I'm not sure if it's been resolved. There's certainly been discussion about landlords not being allowed to put up the rent wildly. Whether or not that's actually been implemented, I couldn't say off the top of my head. But yes, it is a problem.
Is that an issue in your countries as well? Who would say that is something what troubles our current debates on climate energy issues? That's the US, right? Other countries as well?
Although I would say, so now in the UK you have to have an energy performance certificate every time you sell a house or you rent a house. I'm not sure how much people engage with that. I'm not sure how much someone who's renting or buying actually looks at that and thinks that's going to influence my decision.
This energy audit you refer to is a European regulation, right? Still valid in the UK. Is something similar applying in the US? If you sell a house, if you buy a house, any information on energy needs is required? In Oregon. So that's depending on the state. Right. Is that immediately to that point? Or is it a new question? Because there was one before. Okay, then you had a question, right, Jose?
Yeah. My name is Sergio Diaz. I'm an independent consultant. And I lived in Portland, Oregon for quite a few years. And one of the most successful, and I'll get back to why it's relevant, but one of the most successful residential solar projects was one that was run by a community organization. It was a local nonprofit that worked just in a small neighborhood. But what they did was they organized a contractor to come out and for the neighborhood do audits of solar installations. They got the quotes. They worked with the contractor to make sure that it was that it would work for each of the neighbors. They made sure that it was so they did a lot of work that in Portland the year before there were a total of 40 installations of solar panels. That program got 200 neighbors that installed it. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that I worked a little bit with them to talk about working at that level for energy efficiency for lower income. And I guess my question to you is, there's policy, there's private, there's energy companies. There's got to be other models that don't involve those large organizations that work at a more community level that perhaps you've looked at or that perhaps you can look at.
There's been a lot of that in the UK. I would say the money's still come from the same place. It's come from the energy companies, but it's kind of filtered down to those smaller organisations. My experience of it is that they tend to be much more successful schemes. They tend to set their own eligibility criteria. You can do the deep retrofit. Also, I was talking about households being reluctant to go ahead with something because they don't know what it's going to look like. They don't know if it's going to be valuable to them. They're worried about the mess. If you do the street-by-street kind of approaches, it really encourages people to take it up. One of our kind of policy recommendations was the idea of like a show home, like an energy show home. You can actually go in and you can see what's going to happen. You can see what the materials look like. You can see what's actually going to be done to your home. So I think there's a huge amount to be said for that neighbourhood effect. You can go and see what your dad's done. You can go down the road and see what your auntie's done. But also, you probably recognise the charity or the organisation or the local authority that's doing it because they're trusted. And I've got to say, in the UK, particularly our big six energy companies are very, very poorly trusted. There was a mis-selling scandal, don't know how long ago it was, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and the energy sector hasn't really recovered from that. And this bypasses that whole kind of series of problems. So,
Ulla, more questions now. Remember, we start a panel soon, and all the types of questions which could be more general and also, let's say, affect the other speakers, we move that to this panel. So directly to her issue. There was one first, the lady behind.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Arnold. I'm from the United States, recently relocated to Brussels. Hi. So I've worked extensively in healthy housing and in energy efficient housing in the United States, and the problems you're describing about return on investment not being high enough in the worst of the housing, I've encountered over and over again. And my experience in the United States is even if we can make an argument to make a retrofit, nonprofits or public sector, everyone wants return on investment, and the longest return investment I've ever been able to get anyone to agree to is 10 years. Usually it's more 5 years or less. While we all know that degrading housing stock in both older cities in the United States and the UK and Europe is a massive problem long term, and I'm wondering if you know of research that effectively can communicate to donors and nonprofits about the longer term return on investment, like kind of that case to be made, because it's a business case to even nonprofits, at least in the United States. Everything runs on money.
Yeah.
If you want, we can also put that question to the next panel and include Jan into that debate.
That might be a good idea. I can't answer that off the top of my head, I don't think. It's a really interesting question. And I think it's the point I was making at the end about this being a social policy issue. I think it's about it has to come from the state. It has to move away a little bit from that mentality. And in the UK, we didn't always have such a strict mentality. You know, we did think a bit about social investment. And I think we've gone so far to the other end now that if we're willing to put in a boiler and not sort out the pipe work, we're willing to put in a tiny bit of insulation and then leave a house that's completely damp, that has gone so far in the wrong direction. I think that's my concern. But in terms of something more positive, I don't know.
We'll collect that in the next round. One last question to her, and then we go to the panel.
Hi, Andreas Kraft from Agora Energiewende. I have two questions. The first one would be, just on the last point you just made, you mentioned it shouldn't be energy companies having this responsibility. Then the question to you, who should it be?
The state.
But that's too general of an answer for me, at least.
Okay.
So how is it being discussed in terms of how that could be organized? That would be my first question. And my second question would be, in terms of reaching carbon neutrality, we're talking about a much deeper intervention into the energy system in terms of gas will no longer, in its current form, be permitted in 20 years if we mean it seriously. We'll need CO2 pricing at levels that are socially very difficult, and therefore, how is fuel poverty being discussed in this context as well, where it goes beyond the kind of classic fuel poverty conversation?
Yeah. Okay, so with your first question, this used to be offered through the government's Department of Work and Pensions, so it's funded through that because it was regarded as a kind of a social security scheme, so there was funding in place from central government. It was also topped up through local authorities. They had a statutory duty towards fuel poverty, so usually they would have a fuel poverty team that would help address fuel poverty within their area. All of that is gone, and that's my kind of criticism that we've, I was going to say thrown the baby out with the bathwater, but we haven't. We've just got rid of a decent policy. 15 years ago, we'd have said, oh, Warmfront's really problematic. It's got all these issues with it. I think now we're kind of crying over the demise of programmes like Warmfront. In terms of your second question, carbon neutrality, that's a really good question. It is being raised. I think at the moment we're in it's a real kind of baby steps kind of a discussion at the moment. Probably the discussions around it are around fairness and thinking about the impacts of certain measures and certain shifts on certain groups. But I don't think in policy terms we've got that foresight at the moment. We're still talking about retrofit. We're talking about relatively, I suppose you could say relatively minor kind of measures. I would also say my experience of working in policy in the UK over the last, 3 years has been quite problematic. I think it's very difficult to see policy discussions move very far at all because we've got this massive elephant in our room that I'm not going to mention right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline. You can stay. And I invite Jan and Danielle to join us here as well. We have kind of half an hour panel, and while the questions in the first round were meant were meant to ask some direct questions to the presentations, I would now like to focus a little bit on more general issues, and I think the speakers can decide how much of that they can join. You have taken my notes. So I propose, again, you prepare your questions or your contributions. I mean, you are invited to also share the debate, not only put questions. My proposal is that we are looking into the more overarching issues and always having Europe and US in mind, so all types of comparison or sharing one thought from one continent to the other is welcome. The issues I would propose that we look into are changes in societies which are needed in order to make reduction of energy demand and thus also reduction of CO2 emissions possible. Second, incentives to the economy, and third, policies needed in order to bind all that together or to kick it off or to allow it or whatever. So what we also could discuss are the issues around CO2 taxation and in how far that would impact. I was very much thinking about that when you spoke. In Germany we have recent, not only debates, but recent studies which indicate that if you reshuffle different types of taxes, tax CO2 more but reduce other taxations, it would even give a benefit to the poorer part of society. But unfortunately that is often not heard in the loud debates on CO2. So, changes in societies, incentives to economy, and policies needed. Would you like to kick off such a debate? Maybe we go first to changes in societies, our own behavior, the one of our neighbors, of our friends, work of NGOs. How does that relate to what you have heard? Would you like to start? I mean, you said it basically in your presentation. Jan was not so much pointing to that. Maybe Jan, you start.
Sure.
And be very, very sharp in it. What you say should rest in the participants' minds.
I actually had a slide which I skipped with a picture of lots of houses that some of you may have noticed.
Yeah.
And that was to make the point that actually the problem or the barrier is that it's such a dispersed issue. It's not just that you replace some power plants with renewable technology and you solve the problem. You've got to actually persuade millions of billions of people and businesses to be part of it. So I think it's not enough to just offer a few incentives here and there and hope that some people will come forward and be proactive. I think it's a much broader issue that needs to be addressed more holistically, and we can't rely on individuals to make the right decisions. It's difficult. They may not have the funds to do it. So that really is a question that is open-ended. How do we resolve that? And I think it's got to be a more system-wide solution in many instances, and can't just rely on individual consumer choice.
I mean, I definitely think structural solution is important. We can't just rely on trends. I mean, it's really great that Greta has inspired the world, and plastics with Attenborough's BBC Our Blue Planet, plastic became a big discussion. But do we really want to rely on popular culture and trending to save the planet? I think that's dangerous. And I think, ironically, coming from me, considering I work in that field of popular culture and film, but actually why it's so different for me is that we work with experts to make sure there are real structured solutions presented on the back of the content from films. It's nice to have inspiration from films and people like Greta. It's not good enough. It's certainly not strong enough if you don't have experts like yourselves presenting policy angles. For example, you're talking about fuel poverty. I live in it. My mum's from the south, Dorset, and she was presented with one of these options, and she refused it, exactly like you said, because she called me and she said with her Scouse accent from Liverpool, she said, "You're all right there, doll, I'm not too sure about this. Doesn't make much sense to me, like." Yeah. And that's how she felt. She felt she was not informed, and she didn't know how to make that choice. So society requires structural support, definitely.
I don't know. Oh, is it on?
No, if you want to add, otherwise
it's on. Okay, I don't know what to add to that. I agree with both of your points. I think there's a lot to be said for normalisation. So the visibility of these things is really important. We were talking about, having streets with solar panels on. Just that sort of thing makes it more normal. It makes it more acceptable. So, had your mum seen other people that had these things, she might have understood it better and be more willing to go ahead with it. But I also think there's a lot to be said about integrating these things much better into the planning process. If you're thinking about, you know, new buildings, new housing, that kind of thing, we could be doing some really good things. We could have much more efficient, forward-thinking buildings that could showcase what we can do and, again, make things a little bit more normal. Let's say you go to a school and it's got all that new kind of energy efficiency technology. It's got the new, sorry, not very familiar with the words here, it's got those new technologies. That is going to kind of normalise things a bit more.
Are structural changes mainly technological developments, or is structural change much more? What do you think? Is it an answer to that?
Well, the question I have and the issue on that topic, I think the word sufficiency is still lighted in this whole discussion. So
help us, please define sufficiency in regards to efficiency.
I have no exact definition, but I think the basic idea is that here in Western Europe and industrialized countries, most people have a quite comfortable life in physical terms, material and energy, apart from the fuel poverty. That's a big issue, of course. But the large majority of people, nevertheless, live very comfortably. And we always want more in physical terms, our consumption. We always want to increase it. But physically, for our physical well-being, we don't need it anymore. We don't need larger cars, we don't need larger homes, etc. So being content with what we have can drive sufficiency, and then we don't need to increase our consumption all the time and our use of resources. But this, we talk about renewable energy, we talk about energy efficiency a lot, but the third pillar, in my opinion, this sufficiency concept in wealthy countries is still not enough in the debate. I think if we don't solve it, this problem of overconsumption, it will be very difficult to ever solve the energy and resource issues. It's like overpopulation, where people all worry very much, but we don't worry about overconsumption. We consume more than we need.
So maybe we could say efficiency is meeting the same needs or demands with lesser energy, while sufficiency is even questioning the level of what we demand to consume.
It's a very good definition you gave.
Is there a debate in the US on sufficiency? Well, if you ask me, is there one in Europe, I would also not be so sure, but at least some think tanks and some of the NGOs and all that movement is actively bringing these questions into the debate. Maybe something what you take with you back home to the US, maybe you have different terms for that, but it's certainly going to the roots. Let's apply what you just said in the structural changes to the mobility debate. The mobility debate is indicating that the amount of driven kilometers are still going up. In Germany, for example, around 1/3 of the CO2 emissions are coming from the mobility sector. The amount of cars owned by 1,000 people is still going up, except a few big cities. So, is it happening that is all changing, or do we need both in parallel societal changes and new policies? That's lesser an issue maybe to Danielle, but Jan, what would you think?
I'm happy to take that question. I think,
there's
so many layers to that question. I think one is, the needs for transportation in general and individualized transport. Many cities, it's dangerous to drive a bicycle. It's public transport is of poor quality or too expensive. So I think there's a modal shift towards walking, cycling, and public transport has to be front and center. But there will be some residual demand for private car, individual transportation, even though some people are calling for abolishing that, but I don't think that's going to happen. And we can see that places like Norway, where electric vehicles now reach 2/3 of new sales, by putting in place the right incentives, but also by just simply disallowing the old dirty cars to be sold. And maybe even at some point, and cities already do it in Europe, you don't allow them to be driven in the city, and you have low emission zones. And I'm a favor of all of those things. I think you can't just rely on electrification of transport. I think that's, you still have the same issues with the particulate matter, is still an issue even with electric vehicles. Not
many
from the
issues
exhaust
with
pipe,
electric
but
vehicles still.
right, yes, and of course there's resource-intensive use, for the battery production, but it's a much cleaner solution to using, internal combustion engine. So there's got to be a combination, I think, of modal shift in cleaning up the fleet. And then we need pricing signals to really charge those vehicles when they are when they can deliver the most benefit to the power system. So when you have excess renewables, you want to charge them, not when you have an on-peak demand and when you actually turn on the least clean generation. So I think you've got to do all these things in parallel to really achieve a significant reduction in that sector.
Danielle?
I'm not an expert at all, but I have another film which I think is important to raise here. It's called I, Human, and it's about artificial intelligence and its connection to electricity and mobility and electric cars. And I think we really are, what we're doing with this debate on how we can actually, improve the lifespan of the planet, and we're all chasing to exist for a longer period of time. I think with electrification, we really should be having this discussion now to avoid us creating hubs deep under the ocean beds of electric motherboards that are just heating up the planet just in a different way. And I know it's a very controversial topic for me to bring up, but it's a reality. And rather than having this discussion 20 years down the line, we should also be thinking about what you mentioned, the particular matter in electric, and how are we just replacing one solution with another that isn't sustainable enough. And I just think with AI and how AI will infiltrate every walk of our life, we will be using electric, which will also have its negative impact on climate. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
If you walk through Brussels, you see the e-scooters everywhere. Apart from the fact that they are in the middle of the pathways where they should not be, recent studies say that CO2 intensity of a kilometer driven by an e-scooter is higher than driven by an ordinary car, just in brackets on electrification. But you want to add something to that one?
I can. It's not really my area. I think.
No, but I guess that mobility is also a high share of costs for poorer people.
It is. So I used to work at the Stockholm Environment Institute in, I think it was 2003, and I worked on a transport-related project. And I think the way we regarded transport, it was quite technical. We worked with transport engineers, transport planners across a number of different local authorities. And one thing the project leaders I was working with were encouraging was to view transport problems and mobility issues and access issues as more of a social problem rather than an individual issue. So it wasn't simply a case of me not being able to get to work because I didn't have a car, but it might be a case of the employer thinking I can't get my employees to work and so therefore I'm going to put on some kind of transport. So it was that shift in mindset, rather than seeing it as an individual issue, seeing it as more of a societal problem, was something we were trying to work around, which probably didn't have many good results, but it was certainly a good way of thinking. Again, bringing it back to the UK, and probably echoing my presentation, I think in the UK we could really do with substantial investment in infrastructure. Even coming to Brussels yesterday, walking around seeing the cycle lanes, it just felt such a safer place than, for example, London. If you tried to cycle around London, you're probably going to die. If you cycle around here, it feels an awful lot safer. And I think those sorts of things, sort of much more soft kind of instruments, are something that in the UK are really, really super important that we're simply behind with.
And that's London.
All right, you're not going to die. You're not going to die.
It's even named as one of the cities which has done more for cycling than other cities.
But it does have a high mortality rate for cyclists.
Yeah. Well, this is increasing everywhere. The mortality rate of bikers is increasing wherever you increase the bike share. A terrible debate which must be made. There were some of you offering comments?
Hi, yes. I have two further questions. Andreas Graaf from Agora Energiewende. On the issue of increasing pressure in some urban areas in terms of just lack of housing, how does this kind of conversation around quickly developing housing interplay with the fuel poverty issue or the energy efficiency policy discussion? I mean, in Germany, you already see kind of a link in the sense that some politicians will make an effort to make a case for weakening or delaying the implementation of energy efficiency policies. How are there any other connections you see there? And then my second question would be on kind of urban density issues, those tensions there. Is there a case to be made for us focusing a lot more on this issue of urban density as a solution for efficiency, and maybe building more new buildings rather than renovating old ones, or is that kind of a dead end?
Can we start with that second question? Because in a way, in a very different type of way, it affects all of you in regards to what you said.
I would
urban
give the floor
density.
to someone else first.
Someone else
like
first.
A very intimidating question.
Okay, then I ask. You're ready?
Okay, go on then.
Urban density is
urban density. So from a fuel poverty point of view, we tend to see greater problems in rural areas. Rural housing supply is much harder to treat, tends to be off-grid as well, so it's much more costly to put measures in. And again, the energy companies were often not keen to go out into those areas because it was too expensive. Whereas in urban areas, it's much more efficient because you can do, say, whole blocks of flats and all that kind of stuff. So it's just a more efficient way of doing retrofit. I'm not sure that necessarily answers the question, but it's certainly what we saw.
It's certainly a contribution to it, yeah.
Well, I would challenge that to an extent.
Take
I think there will be some benefits of having greater urban density. When I think, transportation, for example, you can see that. But when it comes to cooling demands, you probably have the opposite effect. If you have highly urbanized areas, you have the heat island effect, and we've seen that with the recent heat waves, that it's a lot hotter in urban areas than in rural areas, and that increases the demand for cooling. And in Europe, that's the segment in the energy sector where demand is going up the fastest. It's a very small part of it yet, but it's growing very rapidly. And you could see that, especially in urban areas, that demand could spiral. So I would just caution again, that is their solution to the problem. I think it creates other problems potentially, even though it has beneficial effects on the transport system.
What about the toilets in urban density?
Well, I was just thinking of an example. I hope that this is accurate with my answer that I'm about to give you. Please forgive me if I'm way off. But we were looking at, for example, how a cow one cow's waste can completely fuel light bulbs in your house for an entire day. So rather than looking at urban settings, we were kind of thinking, well, how can cross-sectoral areas, agricultural farmers contribute to this discussion, and how can we actually use waste to improve energy efficiency in rural areas? And I hope I've managed to give you a good example, though. In India, actually, there was a massive investment into plant waste collection, and they managed to hand out more than 10 million jobs in rural areas to create energy-efficient solutions through plant waste. So that's just another side of it. I hope I answered the question effectively there.
Okay. I would like to move towards the next dimension. You said we need structural change or structural incentives or incentives through better structures. For me, that is another expression of we need policies, because all such structure doesn't come on its own. So I understand that you all, from a very different perspective, you call for policies, for regulations, for at least for rules, which are rules for all economic actors, for all people. Correct? Did I understand you correctly? So I would like to open that field, and this would even include the issue of financial incentives, which also would need regulations, CO2 taxation, and so on. And I would like to collect some of your views, and then viewpoints, and then we give it to the three colleagues. Please.
So my name is Reba Carruth from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. I want to thank the panel for excellent panel session today. I personally feel that we're on the cusp of really a new industrial revolution, which requires a socioeconomic framework for policy. And also, when I say policy, I mean particularly for these strategic sectors of policy/industry. So you have agriculture, you have manufacturing, you have transport, and also you have this urban-rural dimension again, and you have natural resources, particularly in the United States. It's that abundant agriculture and natural resource foundation of America and the Americas, which really are, I think, central in this equation. Because as someone mentioned, it's not just the energy efficiency, it's resource efficiency, using less of what you have to use, using it more efficiently. So I'd like to ask the panel, each of you from where you stand, how can we move forward transatlantically? Perhaps with this lens of the US-EU Energy Council, there are a lot of areas of energy efficiency, renewable energy, so on and so forth, were being basically looked at for over a decade. How can we move forward in a very focused way on these sectors to see, start to finish, how energy efficiency can be basically addressed at the multiple levels of governance? So the local, the state, the regional, the national. And we have the multilateral framework really for the policy cooperation, but transatlantically we have other mechanisms now that have been put into place going back to the early 2000s with policy cooperation and regulatory harmonization. Also through this TTIP agreement, which fortunately is under the radar at the moment to keep it out of harm's way. There's a lot of regulatory work that was done between the U.S. and the EU to have science-based.
Is that all still in place? Sorry if I ask.
It's still in place because
it's formally is it applied?
Under the radar because we want to keep it safe at the moment.
I think you owe us some examples which are still in practice.
Yeah, but anyway, I'd like to just open that up to the panel. I really like this notion of deeper, more quality policy, which is really the responsibility of governments.
So,
industry,
question on policies, on EU-US exchange on policies, or cooperation through policies? Or policies?
Yes. I mean, you do have to have private cooperation, industry leadership in cooperation with governments to meet a collective good. But I would just like to go with each of the panelists and see where that would bring us.
Good. Let's start with Caroline. I know that's a very difficult question for you, but I would add mine. Have you looked beyond the UK also in your researches? Because that's a question on Europe and US.
Yeah, I mean, we've done quite a bit of work, statistical work, across the EU. So looking at mental health and fuel poverty across all member states. We've looked at health and fuel poverty as well. We've done quite a lot of work around definitions and measurement of fuel poverty, so coming up with European measures, looking at different countries. So I think France has got a definition of fuel poverty, so we've worked with that. I can't remember if Germany's got one or not. It was a few years ago that I did that.
So give us your vision. What would be for Europe, but particularly UK, the policies needed in order to meet the needs you see? And how could that then be, let's say, exchanged with the US? Maybe that's better you
I think
to ask our guests.
Going back to my presentation, I think we need state interest in this at national government level, and I'm very concerned where we are at the moment. I'm sure you agree in the US. So it's very difficult to give a positive answer. I think we need to keep having these kind of meetings. We need to be collecting the evidence. We need the data. We need to be sharing experience and not giving up. But
I'm sure that in that community of discussion you will be invited, even if your country is not part of the EU anymore. The more we need your opinions. Sorry, I don't want to make you sad. I was very shocked when she said that the privatization of the energy systems increased the costs, because we were always told that the opposite would happen.
Well, it added on to energy bills. So all these schemes were funded through energy bills, so it naturally put money onto energy bills, whereas previously it had come through general taxation, which is a much fairer way of...
But as such, I understood that you said privatization of these energy structures are resulting in higher costs rather than in lower costs as such.
And that's why the energy companies are under such pressure to keep their costs down and to demonstrate high carbon savings, because they have to show that they're not costing the bill payer huge amounts of money. And so it's a really massively political issue, basically.
So the state, more state intervention, that is your vision in brief. Danielle?
I'm coming from a very community-based approach here. So from my perspective, I think the discussion, transatlantic and generally, it has to transcend this idea of, you know, personal, individual, corporate responsibility, government responsibility. It's not a responsibility, it's an obligation. So rather than going into this volunteering idea of helping the planet become a better place, we should have transcending governance that gives incentives at every level. So as an individual, I should be incentivized to do what's right, but also as a corporation delivering these kinds of services, they should be incentivized to be able to offer the right solutions. And you mentioned this in your discussion, and I think what happens is this complete disconnect between a corporate's incentives and an individual's incentives. So what happens is the corporate interest versus the individual interest, there's no connection. And then governance is not monitored or reviewed. You know, we have the capacity now with technology to really collect massive amounts of data and review policies that work effectively regionally, locally, nationally, internationally. And I think we should also hold governance to account. We should be able to say, this worked here, but it doesn't work here. In this rural area, it works like this. In this area, it works like this. I know I'm generalizing now, but I think it really is a dialogue, which you say all the mechanisms are in place. None of them are really implementing the dialogue in a way that I think would make it interesting for us at every level. But that's just a very general response.
So, state intervention and from responsibility to obligation of everybody, not only of the state. Two clear statements. Yeah.
It's a great question. And you know, my organization works exactly in that space. You know, sharing best practices. So we were founded in the US in the early 90s. And the former EU director was actually a former regulator from the US, Richard Coward from Vermont. And what we often do is that we take the best examples we can find globally and take them to the place that's looking to implement a new policy. And sometimes those examples come from the US, sometimes they come from other places in the world. So I don't think it's just a transatlantic dialogue, I think it's a global dialogue, and we got to sort of look for the best examples we can find, adapt them, and then implement them in the places where there's a desire to make change happen. And you can actually see that in the specifics of the Clean Energy for All package in Europe. You see a lot of elements which are based on experience elsewhere. I talk about capacity markets, a highly technical issue. A lot of the reform that's taking place is based on the experience in the US. And vice versa, in the US you will find building codes that are modeled on what happens in Europe, for example. So I think there is an exchange taking place. Do we need more of it? Of course we do. But that's exactly, I think, the right venue for creating that conversation. Your second, or your first question actually was about socioeconomic change and how to achieve that. And just you give you very specific. The Netherlands have decided to get out of gas completely. You know, no more gas for heating in the Netherlands. And they have asked every local authority, every municipality, to come up with a plan how to deliver that. So they start with a consultation. They ask the citizens in their community, what do you think should happen? And then the community decides what is, you know, is it going to be electrification? Is it district heating? You know, is it a combination of efficiency with all the other elements? And then that gets implemented and gets funded. So it's very interesting how they do it. They don't approach it by saying every individual has to, you know, make a certain change and get some incentive, but they actually take a community decision and then implement it. Will it work? Who knows? You know, they just started. But I think that's an interesting example to look at going forward, because they really take very drastic measures. Not because of climate change, actually. It's because of earthquakes that they observe, because of gas exploitation. But I still think it's a really interesting example, great case study we can all learn from.
Thank you, Jan. I guess that the municipalities are leading such community debates?
Yeah, it's led by the municipalities. They often will involve third-party actors to help with that, facilitate that. But the obligation is on the local governments to come up with a decarbonization plan, for heating.
I mean, coming from working with local governments, I of course very much agree to that. But imagine the challenges for mayors, for council members, who are used to implement law, to be creative, to manage their communities, also including small issues, and now they have to debate an energy transition with such a lot of information, conflicting information. I mean, this is a huge challenge for these people locally, and they certainly need education, training, support of all types. And the same might apply in your field.
Well, I was just going to say to the lady's point as well, I mean, if your political leaders are selling a narrative whereby this should not be a priority, which is happening globally. We cannot omit. I mean, the big elephant in the room here is we're all feeling like we should do this, but the leaders that are leading our countries are often standing by a different narrative. That means that we have an even more difficult struggle. I mean, I know the lady in my film said poop to power, but I really would say people to power in this sense, in this discussion. Because if we take it from the leadership level, at the moment there are some, false truths that are getting, disinformation even, that's getting spread around. So that's something that has to be dealt with in the community as well, I think. And federal ways, I think, is a really strong, municipal ways is a strong way of dealing with that, rather than just leaving it to the kind of national level.
Let's add some comments more from the US side also to this. You mentioned there is a rich exchange, transatlantic exchange already. Maybe you have some wishes or some thematic areas where you think it should be further increased on policies. Can you just raise your hands who want to speak? So, yes, you, and then you.
Hi, Kevin Gertig from City of Fort Collins, Colorado, U.S., and I'm the Executive Director of a utility. We offer 4 services: water, wastewater, stormwater, and light and power. And
in municipal hands or
in
public hands?
one municipal area. And I would submit local government can be great, and I would submit that it's really incumbent upon cities to encourage engagement with their local community. And we have a climate action plan. We're very engaged, and we do a lot of outreach. So in order to really encompass citizens and to really move forward, I think it's imperative that local government actually engage their citizens and their customers, and then have programs that can align with both climate action as well as rate structures, et cetera, to accommodate that. And I would be happy today to talk about our programs, because I could go on and on about our climate action plan and how we're aligning to that. It's a multi-year goal with set objectives, and we're very transparent. So by doing this, I think it's transparent, it provides accountability, and it also provides a framework to make a difference as we go forward. So I just wanted to comment. Again, I've got full of examples, but to keep it short, and then perhaps if individuals would like to discuss that later today, I would be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to have a guest speaker this afternoon who certainly speaks more about local climate action plans in Europe. So that could be a connection point for you as well.
Thank you. Just my brief comment is, in New Orleans, we have a very interesting relationship with our local utility. We are one of only 2 entities in the U.S. where the local municipality is regulating the utility, D.C. being the other. And so that means we have a lot of power in terms of how we can direct them to implement our existing climate action strategy. However, that power is not really being exercised because we don't have expertise on staff at the City Council to help drive those discussions. So City Council has made the decision to pay a third-party vendor many millions of dollars to advise them instead of hiring in-house staff that could be built up to develop that expertise. So I just wanted to offer that, you hit the nail on the head, which is, even when the local government wants to do the right thing and wants to go in the right direction, they may not know how to do that. And they may be doing it in a wasteful way, or they may not have the level of citizen engagement that's required. So, I'm the only paid staff person in City Hall that's working on energy, right? And so I'm obviously, not enough people to do that in 40 hours a week. So we welcome further engagement with this group and other partners here.
Thank you. Further comments from your side? Policy exchange, transatlantic learning? 1 or 2 more we can do.
Hi, my name is Arlene. I'm from Brazil. My comment is, as we are organized differently from US or from some countries in Europe, we have more centralized government. because that our policy is more centralized and the local centralized. So the local actions is there are some local actions, but the money depends on the central government. So because that we are it's difficult to move forward in the local area.
So responsibility to act must go along with resources available.
Related to energy, because we have a integrated system, almost all the decision is taken in the government, the central government area.
Thank you. That was certainly very necessary point of view from another perspective. We are coming to the end of that panel discussion. If you want a last sentence, which you want to keep all participants in mind, Danielle?
I'll let someone else start.
Don't be shy.
I don't really know.
Earlier you said you want engagement for continuing your film?
Yes, I mentioned that we're 75% way through the development, so if I were to leave a message here today, it would be just if anybody is anti-biogas, we'd love to hear from you, and if anybody is working with kind of biogas natural methods in their companies, we'd love to hear from you as well from a European perspective, but also US and across in different areas. We've filmed in Brazil, we've filmed in Colombia, we've filmed in India. I guess I'll just stick with the comment I made before, which is obligation or responsibility.
Thank you. Jan, EU legislation on saving and efficiency? What would you like our colleagues to remember?
Well, I think the technologies and the policies that we need already exist today, and it's all about making it work in the timescales that we have left. And I think that requires all of us to keep pushing those ideas, and it requires, I think it requires politicians to respond to the demands of the young generation, and then that enables us, in turn, to suggest what should happen, and hopefully policymakers adopting those ideas.
Caroline?
I think everything we talked about this morning, to me, is a public policy problem, and it should be treated as such. And I appreciate it's difficult times politically at the moment, but it won't always be like this. So carry on.
Carry on. Okay, that's a good last statement. Thank you very much to the three of you. That was the first part of the three parts which I had mentioned earlier, discover. We are now changing our settings and the way on how we continue, and I just mentioned that to you, and then there will be a break. The new style of between some minutes and 3 o'clock is meant to be short interventions from, I think, 11 or so speakers in an interview style. And the idea of the organizers was that there is a combination for you possible between listening, questioning, eating, because lunch is served, walking around, talking to your colleagues, and looking at these stands. That's multitasking point 4. So maybe we can further develop that idea a little bit and go now to lunch, eat, talk, maybe using the time to also look at the stands and decide where you want to go again with more time. And I would then recommend that most of you come back at 12:15 to listen to those who are here for the interviews, because that's just polite to listen to them. And you are allowed to bring your food with you on your plate, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So please stroll around now, get your food, get your ideas, get your talks, and be back at 12:15.
If you want to accept this very program.
That applause is basically for the three. Please.
Right here, under this.
I'm very underdressed. I'm dressed in
That's perfect. We don't want you to be fake. There's enough fake. You can hold
You want me to hold it?
Yes.
Oh, you want us to...
That works?
Either way is fine.
Branding.
Yeah, wunderbar. Excellent. So the book is bilingual. It has a lot of German, but also same amount of English.
Good to know, as I'm not fluent in German.
Well, you can learn a lot of German now.
I can.
Thank you.
Got it?
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope questions were too tough. Yeah, yes. So you really deserve a lunch.
Yes, and I need to check what the Supreme Court decided.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yes, they ruled. They ruled. Yeah.
What? What did they do?
So again, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, we don't have any alcoholic beverages until the reception. Really sorry, but it's Brussels. Can't be far.
Some people I speak with, they said it's so much fun that they stay, but okay. It's not that we don't know.
Hi, Carolyn. Could I ask you to give us a very short interview for our conference?
Yeah?
Yeah?
What do you want me to say?
To my colleague, because he will do the interview.
Very presidentially. Yes, the Labour Party. So with such Labour style divide, Labour must, Labour says goodbye to politics in my, I'm a member of the Labour Party. Yeah. It's, I think, both if Labour would have known me the point to say we want to stay in, but we want to continue to reform, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure if it's unbelievable how the Social Democrats around Europe just get off what is publicly relevant. It's the same trouble. Oh, me and my husband were motivated this year. The summit spent 3 weeks driving around.
Yeah.
Northern Tunnel will be like skiing, so in the winter we can ski. It's like, oh, that's very good.
Bingo.
And you start so easy. Huh? You start so easy. Yeah, but in November.
Yes. Yes. We also have video. I can mark where.
No, it's just to know because I will ask the colleague then to bring me something to eat because I have no time to go out and eat something. So
Yeah.
Just to know if you need me, but okay, I look for the colleagues who will bring me something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
No problem.
Great.
Hi,
Great.
if I could ask a quick question.
Sure.
Yeah, so I do work with affordable housing in the United States, in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay.
And I think we have, I don't know if it's an odd setup, it's the only place I've ever done this work, but we have a setup where, and I'm not sure about private housing, but for like federally funded housing through tax credits, each state is responsible for vetting the developers who are renovating those properties, and as part of that vetting process, there's a different application, and each state is responsible for designing their own application, and there are requirements for the quality of the renovation, so developers have to commit to providing these measures, or part of it is increasing energy efficiency by like 20% and things like that. It seems really good. And then what we find in practice is that developers will commit and then sort of go through the motions or hire contractors that don't know what they're doing.
It's the contractors,
so I feel like the gap that exists between basically policymakers' good intentions of improving housing there's just this long telephone chain of like the building science expertise informs the policymakers, and they're like, cool, we can act on this and make these good policies, and then the people who implement at the very like literal level
in the home
they miss the mark. And so I was wondering if sort of what that looks like in the UK, and what do you guys have enforcement measures or tracking on effectiveness of policies that you guys have done? And I know you were talking more about private housing.
But I think the issues are going to be the same. I would have a look. If you go to there, you can get the full reports.
Okay,
and
cool.
I think they're massive, like 100 pages, so that will give you quite a good insight. I think the big issue for me with this particular scheme that I was talking about is called ECO, the energy company's obligation. The energy companies literally had to install X number of measures in X number of homes with X number of carbon benefits. So that was their target. And then they'd pass that down to smaller companies. So you'd end up with a supply chain like that. And it's exactly what you're describing. And also every little company would be taking a little cut of the money.
Yeah, exactly.
And the policy objectives would be lost at the point of implementation. Oh my God, is this...